Take that disgusting thing off my table before I have it incinerated. That was the exact sentence my mother used while she was holding my grandmother's hand-stitched quilt between two fingers like it was a dead rat. We had just buried Grandma 4 hours earlier. The casseroles from the neighbours were still warm on the sideboard, and there she was, my own mother, dangling the only thing my grandmother had specifically left to me, asking the housekeeper to bring her a trash bag. My stepfather laughed from the recliner, the way he always laughed when she was being cruel. Like cruelty was a sport they played together for points. He raised his bourbon and said, "Smells like a damn nursing home." Then he reached over and poured the rest of his drink right into the center of the quilt. The bourbon spread across the cotton in a slow, ugly stain, and I just stood there in my black dress, holding a stack of dirty paper plates, feeling something in my chest go very, very quiet. Before I tell you what was sewn into the lining of that quilt, and how I used 2 months of silence to let them set fire to their own lives, hit the comment section and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I need to know who's standing with me in this kitchen, because what I did next started in that exact moment, and I want you to understand why I didn't scream, why I didn't grab the quilt and run, why I picked up the trash bag myself and said, "I'll take care of it, Mama." My name is Wren Caldwell. I'm 28 years old. And to understand what happened next, you have to go back about 90 minutes to the cemetery in a little town called Beaufort, South Carolina, where my grandmother was lowered into the red Carolina clay next to my grandfather. The pastor said something about a life well lived. My mother cried so loud and so theatrical that even the funeral director glanced sideways at her. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in 3 years, not since the night my grandmother told me. Very quietly, sitting on the porch of her little blue house out on St. Mile. "Helena Island, Wren baby, if anything ever happens to me, the quilt is yours. Not the house, not the savings, the quilt. You understand me?" I had nodded. I hadn't nodded. I hadn't nodded. I hadn't understood. I thought she was being sentimental. She was 84 years old, sharp as a tack, and a woman who had survived 2 husbands and 1 stroke. I should have known sentimentality wasn't her style. After the burial, everyone came back to my mother's house in Mount Pleasant, the big Lowcountry colonial she'd bought with money that I would later realize was never hers to spend. My mother's name is Bernadette. My stepfather's name is Glenn. He came into our lives when I was 16, and he never bothered to pretend he liked me. I was useful. I made coffee. I refilled drinks. I emptied ashtrays. I was the living help they didn't have to pay, because I had nowhere else to go after my grandmother got sick and stopped being able to take me in for the summers. So that afternoon, after the funeral, I was doing what I always did, refilling, emptying, smiling at people I didn't know. And my mother walked into the dining room, opened small cedar box my grandmother's lawyer had handed her at the cemetery, and pulled out the quilt. She didn't read the note that was pinned to it. She didn't even unfold it. She just made a face like she'd opened a container of spoiled milk and said, "Lord, did she keep this in the garage? It smells." That's when she dangled it. That's when Glenn poured bourbon on it. That's when I picked up the trash bag and said, "I'll take care of it, Mama." I carried that quilt out the side door, past the herb garden Glenn never watered, past the trash cans, and around to the little potting shed where my mother kept her gardening gloves and her wine fridge. I closed the door behind me, I sat down on an overturned planter, and I unfolded the quilt across my lap. The note was still pinned to the corner. It was in my grandmother's handwriting, the loopy cursive she'd learned at a one-room schoolhouse in 1948. "Wren, baby, the truth is in the stitches. Find the red one. Love, Granny." I turned the quilt over. It was a double wedding ring pattern, the kind she used to make for weddings, all done in soft blues and yellows and creams. And on the back, in the very corner, almost invisible against the cream fabric, was a single square of bright red thread stitched in a tight little spiral. I picked at it with my fingernail. The thread pulled away easily. Underneath the red stitching, there was a slit in the lining. And inside the slit, folded into a tight rectangle no bigger than a credit card, was a piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly. My hands were shaking. It was a notarized copy of my grandmother's last will and testament, dated 8 months ago, stamped and signed by a lawyer named Henrietta Boudreau out of Charleston. And in plain English, in the very first paragraph, my grandmother left her entire estate, including the house on St. Luding, Helena Island, the 4-acre lot it sat on, her 2 retirement accounts, and a savings account I didn't even know existed to me. Wren Caldwell, her granddaughter, sole beneficiary. Bourbon was bleeding through the cotton, just inches from the paper. I lifted the document and pressed it against my chest. I sat in that potting shed for a long time. I could hear my mother laughing inside the house. The kind of laugh she used when she was telling a story she'd told 100 times. Probably the one about how she single-handedly kept her mother alive for the last decade of her life. I had heard her tell it twice already that day. The truth was that my grandmother had paid for her own care. The truth was that my mother had not visited her for the last 14 months. The truth was that my grandmother had hated my mother by the end, and the feeling had been entirely mutual, and the document in my hands proved it. Now here's the thing I want you to understand, because this is the part where most people would have gone tearing back into that house, waving the will like a sword. I almost did. I stood up. I had my hand on the doorknob. And then I thought about something my grandmother used to say when we play cards on her front porch. She'd say, "Wren, a smart woman doesn't show her hand. She waits until everybody else has bet everything they own." Because here's what would have happened if I had walked back into that dining room with the will. My mother would have snatched it. She would have called it a forgery. She would have hired a lawyer the same day. She would have filed a contest in probate court. And she had the kind of money that could keep a probate fight going for years. And in the meantime, she would have moved into my grandmother's house. She would have changed the locks. She would have sold the antiques. She would have done what she always did, which was take what she wanted and dare anybody to stop her. The will on its own wasn't enough. I needed her to do something so stupid, so illegal, that no lawyer in the state of South Carolina could save her. I folded the will back into its little rectangle. I tucked it into the inside pocket of my dress, the one I'd sewn there myself after my mother went through my purse one too many times. I took the quilt, the bourbon-soaked, beautiful ruined quilt, and I folded it back up. I walked out to the trash cans. I lifted the lid of the green one, and then I walked back to the potting shed and hid it behind the wine fridge, because I wasn't going to let her win even that. Then I went back into the house. I smiled. I refilled my stepfather's bourbon. I told my mother the quilt was gone, and I started waiting. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. I had to pretend nothing had changed. I had to listen to my mother on the phone with a real estate agent, talking about the property on St. Helena, as if it were already hers. I had to watch my stepfather walk around the house with a tape measure, pricing out renovations to a place he didn't own. I had to make the coffee and refill the bourbon and say, "Yes, Mom," and "Yes, sir," while every cell in my body was screaming. But I waited, because I knew something they didn't know. Bernadette and Glenn were broke, not regular broke, catastrophically broke. I had figured this out about 6 months earlier, when I'd been pulling my mother's dry cleaning out of her car, and a stack of envelopes had fallen out of the passenger seat. Final notices from the IRS, a second mortgage statement on the Mount Pleasant house, a collections letter from a credit card I didn't know my mother had, the kind of mail that you don't put in the actual mailbox because you don't want anyone to see it. I put the envelopes back exactly where I'd found them. I'd never said a word, but I'd watched after that. I'd noticed when the housekeeper stopped coming. I'd noticed when my mother started buying her wine at the grocery store instead of the wine shop. I'd noticed when Glenn sold his second car. They were drowning, and they were counting on my grandmother's estate to pull them out. So when, 3 weeks after the funeral, I heard my mother on the phone with the real estate agent saying, "We need to put the St. Colvin Helena property on the market as soon as possible this month if we can," I knew the trap was about to spring itself, except they hit a wall. The wall was the title. The property on St. Helena had been in my grandfather's family since the 1920s. The deed history was old, complicated, full of Lowcountry land that had been passed down through cousins and second marriages and informal handshakes. A clean title search was going to take weeks, maybe months, and Bernadette didn't have weeks. I was polishing the silver in the dining room one afternoon, the day after Easter, when I heard her in the kitchen with Glenn hissing, "We need cash. Now, the visa is maxed, the car payment bounced." Glenn, with that lazy drawl of his, said, "Hard money loan. I know a guy in North Charleston. He does private lending, doesn't care about title issues, just wants collateral and a notary." Bernadette said, "How much can he do?" Glenn said, 600,000, maybe 7. 12% interest, balloon payment in 9 months. You sign over the St. file. Helena property is collateral. The money's in your account by Friday. $600,000, collateralized by a property they didn't own. I kept polishing. My face didn't change. I didn't even let my breath change. But inside, every piece of the chess game my grandmother had been teaching me my whole life finally clicked into place. They were going to commit federal bank fraud. They were going to sign legal documents claiming to be the owners of a property they had no legal right to. They were going to wire that loan into Bernadette's checking account. And the second that wire cleared, this stopped being a family argument and started being a federal crime. I finished the silver. I put the rag away. I went outside, walked all the way down to the end of the driveway, and called the number on the business card I'd been carrying in my dress pocket for 3 weeks. "Henrietta Boudreau, attorney at law." She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Ms. Boudreau, this is Wren Caldwell. My grandmother left me a quilt." She said, "Honey, I've been waiting for your call." We met the next morning. She was a black woman in her 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of office where the bookshelves were actually full of books. She read the will. She made copies. She filed the original with the probate court that same afternoon. And then she sat me down and said, "Wren, your grandmother told me this might happen. She wanted to give you something better than just a house. She wanted to give you the chance to handle this the right way. So tell me what your mother is planning." I told her about the hard money loan. I told her about the conversation in the kitchen. I told her about Glenn's guy in North Charleston. Miss Guy. Boudreau listened, and when I was done, she took off her reading glasses, set them on her desk, and said, "Sweetheart, what your mother is about to do is wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft, because she's about to sign documents claiming an identity she doesn't legally have, which is the lawful owner of that property. The lender, if he's a real lender, will be the victim. But if the lender is dirty, if he knows the title's not clean and he's doing it anyway, he's committing it too. Either way, the second that money moves, this becomes a federal matter." She paused. She looked at me with the kindest, sharpest eyes I had ever seen in my life. She said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because we can stop them right now. We can file an injunction tomorrow. The house is yours either way." I thought about Glenn pouring bourbon on the quilt. I thought about my mother dangling it like a dead rat. I thought about every birthday she'd forgotten, every check she'd cashed in my name when I was a minor, every time she'd told me I was lucky to have a roof over my head while she sold off the furniture my grandfather had made by hand. I said, "Ma'am, I want to do it the right way." Ms. Boudreau picked up her phone and made one call. The person on the other end was a friend of hers, a special agent named Delphine Marchetti out of the FBI's Charleston field office. The closing was set for the following Friday. Friday morning came up grey and humid, the kind of Charleston spring day where the air feels like it's holding its breath. I made coffee. I set out the good cups. I'd put on my black dress, the one with the inside pocket. The lender, a man named Sully Whitman, arrived at 10 o'clock with a notary, a thick leather portfolio, and the kind of cologne that announced him from 3 rooms away. He had a gold chain visible under his shirt collar and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Bernadette was wearing the pearls my grandfather had given my grandmother for their 40th anniversary. She had taken them out of my grandmother's jewelry box the day after the funeral. Glenn was in a blazer that didn't quite fit anymore. They sat down at the dining room table, the one Glenn had poured bourbon on my grandmother's quilt at, and Sully started laying out documents, a loan application, a promissory note, a deed of trust naming the St. Helena property as collateral, an affidavit of ownership sworn under penalty of perjury stating that Bernadette Caldwell was the sole legal owner of the property at 1247 Cottonfield Lane, St. Helena Island, South Carolina. I served the coffee. I poured cream. I moved like furniture because that's what I had been trained to do in that house for 12 years. Bernadette picked up the pen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even pretend to read. She signed the loan application. She signed the promissory note. She signed the deed of trust. And then she signed the affidavit, the one that said, under penalty of perjury, that she owned a house she did not own. The notary stamped each document. The sound of that stamp coming down on the wood of my grandfather's dining table was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. Sully Whitman turned his laptop around. He said, "Initiating wire now. $650,000. Funds will land in your account in approximately 90 seconds. Bernadette let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a giggle. Glenn squeezed her shoulder. He said, "Told you, baby. Easy money." I picked up the empty cream pitcher. I walked into the kitchen. I took my phone out of my apron pocket. I had been on a silent call with Ms. Boudreau for the last 40 minutes. She was sitting in a black SUV at the end of the driveway. She was not alone. I said very quietly into the phone, "It's done." She signed everything. The wire just cleared. Miss Boudreau said, "Stand back from the door, Wren." I walked back into the dining room. My mother had her phone out, checking her bank balance, her face transformed by the kind of greedy, oily joy I had been watching her perform my whole life. She looked up at me. She said, "Wren, baby, go get the good champagne from the wine fridge." "We're celebrating," I said. "Mama, before I do that, can I ask you something?" She rolled her eyes. She said, "What, child? Spit it out." I said, "Did you really just mortgage Granny's house for $650,000? She laughed. She actually laughed. She said, "Honey, it's my house. It's been my house since the second that woman closed her eyes. Now go get the champagne before I lose my patience." I said, "I just wanted to make sure I had it right." That was when the front door opened. It didn't burst. It didn't crash. It opened, very calmly, and 4 people in dark windbreakers with 3 letters across the chest walked into the foyer like they owned the place. Special Agent Delphine Marchetti was at the front. Ms. Boudreau was behind her, holding a leather folder. 2 more agents flanked the doorway. Agent Marchetti said, "Bernadette Caldwell, Glenn Hutchins, Sully Whitman, FBI. Hands where I can see them, please." Glenn knocked his chair over trying to stand up. Sully Whitman went the color of skim milk. He grabbed his laptop and held it out like a shield. He said, "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. She told me the title was clean. She showed me a deed." Agent Marchetti said, "Sir, we'll discuss your role at the field office. Right now, I need you to step away from the table." Bernadette stood up so fast that the pearls rattled. She said, "What is the meaning of this? This is my home. You can't just walk in here." Agent Marchetti looked at her. She said, "Ma'am, you just used a property you do not legally own as collateral on a federally regulated loan. The money has moved across state lines. That is wire fraud. That is bank fraud. That is aggravated identity theft. You are under arrest." I stepped forward. I reached into the inside pocket of my dress. I pulled out the will, the same little folded rectangle I had been carrying for 2 months. I handed it to Agent Marchetti. I said, "This is my grandmother's last will and testament. It was notarized 8 months ago by Ms. Boudreau, who is standing right there. It leaves the property at 1247 Cottonfield Lane to me. The deed my mother just signed is not worth the paper it's printed on. And she knew it. Bernadette stared at me. I watched the realization move across her face in slow motion, the way you watch a wave roll in from far out. Her mouth opened, her mouth closed. She said in a voice that didn't sound like hers, You little snake. I said, Mama, you taught me to be quiet. I just got really good at it. They cuffed her right there at the dining room table. They cuffed Glenn against the sideboard. Sully Whitman, the lender, was led out to a separate car. He was already trying to make a deal, talking fast about how Bernadette had assured him, how he had emails, how he had been deceived. Agent Marchetti said to him very calmly, Sir, we already have your emails. We've had them for 3 weeks. That was when I realized, Miss Quilt. Bedrew and Agent Marchetti had been 3 moves ahead of all of us. They had been watching Sully Whitman for months. He was already under investigation for a string of predatory loans, and my mother had walked herself right into the middle of a federal sting. I exhaled. For the first time in 2 months, maybe for the first time in 12 years, I exhaled all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. And then Glenn, with his hands cuffed behind his back, smiled. He smiled the way he had smiled when he poured bourbon on the quilt. He turned his head and he said to Agent Marchetti, Before you take us anywhere, you should know that my stepdaughter has a documented history of mental illness. We have a court order. As of yesterday afternoon, she is under emergency conservatorship. She does not have the legal capacity to inherit anything, much less to file a will. He nodded toward a manila envelope on the sideboard. I had been polishing the silver right next to that envelope all morning, and I had not seen it. Agent Marchetti said, Show me. Glenn tilted his chin. One of the other agents picked up the envelope, opened it, and pulled out a document. It was an emergency conservatorship order. It was signed by a probate judge in Berkeley County. It declared me, Ran Marie Caldwell, mentally incapacitated due to severe depressive episodes, paranoid ideation, and a history of fabricating family conflicts. It granted temporary guardianship of my person and my estate to Glenn Hutchins, my stepfather. It was dated the day before. The room got very quiet. Agent Marchetti looked at the document. She looked at me. She said, Miss Caldwell, were you aware of this proceeding? I said, No, ma'am, I was not. Bernadette, even in cuffs, smiled. She said, We tried to help her. She's been unwell for years. The will is the product of a sick mind. The property comes to us by default. The conservatorship is signed by a sitting judge. You have to honor it. For about 10 seconds, I felt the floor tilt. I felt every plan, every careful piece of patience, every quiet morning of polishing silver while they laughed in the next room, start to slide away from me. And then Miss Boudreau stepped forward. She said, Agent Marchetti, before you make any decision, you should know 2 things. She opened her leather folder. She pulled out a stapled document. She said, the first thing, the conservatorship order was obtained on the basis of a psychiatric affidavit signed by a Dr. Terv. Lambert Pruitt, who lost his license in the state of Georgia in 2019 for falsifying patient records. He is not currently licensed to practice in the state of South Carolina. His affidavit is, on its face, fraudulent. She pulled out a second document. She said, the second thing, 6 weeks ago, on the recommendation of her grandmother's estate plan, Ren Caldwell underwent a voluntary forensic psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Imogen Calloway, the senior forensic psychiatrist at the Medical University of South Carolina. The evaluation found her to be of sound mind, above average cognitive functioning, no indication of mood disorder, no indication of delusional thinking, and fully capable of managing complex financial matters. The report is dated, notarized, and on file with the court. She handed both documents to Agent Marchetti. She said, the conservatorship order was obtained through perjury. That is a felony. Filing a fraudulent affidavit in a probate proceeding is also a felony. And presenting that order to federal agents in order to obstruct an investigation is obstruction of justice. Agent Marchetti read both documents. She looked at Glenn. She said, "Sir, did you submit an affidavit from an unlicensed physician in order to obtain emergency conservatorship over your stepdaughter?" Glenn's smile fell off his face like a leaf in November. He said, "I didn't. I didn't know. The doctor told me. The doctor told me he was licensed." Agent McKetty said, "Sir, you are now also under arrest for perjury, fraud upon the court, and obstruction of justice." Glenn tried to back up. There was nowhere to back up to. They cuffed him again, this time tighter. As they walked him past me toward the door, he looked at me with the kind of hate that I had seen on his face for 12 years and had never once been able to name out loud. I said very quietly, "Granny told me you would try this. She told me exactly what to do." He didn't answer. He couldn't. After they were gone, after the cars pulled out of the driveway and the dining room was empty, except for me and Miss Bridreau and the cold coffee on my grandfather's table, I sat down. I put my head in my hands, and for the first time in 3 years, I cried. Miss Bridreau sat next to me. She didn't say anything. She just put one hand on my back, between my shoulder blades, the way my grandmother used to do when I was little, and the world was too loud. 6 months later, I drove out to St. Helena Island. The house was mine. The title was clean. The hard money loan had collapsed the day Sully Whitman was indicted, and the money was returned to the lender's bank. Bernadette took a plea deal for 36 months in federal prison. Glenn got 51 months plus a contempt charge for the fake conservatorship. Sully Whitman got 6 years and lost his license to lend money in the state of South Carolina forever. Dr. Lambert Pruitt was indicted in 3 states. The little blue house was exactly the way my grandmother had left it. The porch swing still creaked. The hydrangeas were starting to come back. I walked through every room, and in the back bedroom where she used to keep her sewing machine, I found 3 more quilts folded neatly in a cedar chest. I checked the linings. I checked the corners. I didn't find any more wills. What I did find, in the bottom of the chest under the quilts, was a letter. It was addressed to me. It said, "Wren, baby. By the time you read this, it's over. I know it was hard. I know you wanted to scream. But you didn't, did you? You let them do it themselves. That's all I ever wanted you to learn. You don't fight a bully by hitting back. You fight a bully by handing them enough rope and stepping out of the way. The house is yours. The land is yours. But the real inheritance, my girl, is the part of you that finally knows you were never the one who was crazy. Love, Granny." I'm not going to sell the house. I'm not going to rent it out either. I'm working with a local nonprofit and a small team of volunteers to turn it into a transitional home for women in the Lowcountry who are leaving financially abusive families. We're calling it Cottonfield House. There are 6 bedrooms. There's a kitchen big enough to feed an army. There's a porch where you can sit and watch the marsh grass turn gold at sunset. And on the wall of the front parlor, in the shadow box made by a local carpenter, hangs my grandmother's bourbon-stained, hand-stitched double wedding ring quilt. Right next to it, in a small frame, is the note she pinned to it the day she died. The truth is in the stitches. Find the red one. If you've ever lived in a house where you had to be quiet to survive, if you've ever been told you were crazy by the people who were actually making you crazy, if you've ever been the one pouring the coffee while everyone else was plotting at the table, share this story. Send it to the woman in your life who needs to hear it. And remember what my grandmother taught me, sitting on that porch on St. Helena Island, all those long Carolina summers ago. The quiet ones aren't weak. The quiet ones aren't weak. The quiet ones are listening. And sometimes the quiet ones are the only people in the room who know exactly where the bodies are buried. I think about that quilt almost every day now. Not the bourbon stain. Not the cruel laugh my mother let out when she dangled it between 2 fingers. I think about the hands that stitched it. My grandmother sat at her kitchen table on St. Helena Island for months, sewing a red spiral into the lining of a wedding ring quilt, knowing exactly what kind of woman her own daughter had become. She did not save me. She gave me the tools to save myself. That is a very different thing, and I have come to understand the difference matters more than almost anything else I have ever learned. What happened in that house on Mount Pleasant did not happen because Bernadette was unlucky. It did not happen because Glenn got caught up in something he did not understand. It happened because every small, cruel choice they made for 12 years compounded, the way debt compounds, until the bill came due all at once. They poured bourbon on a quilt. They forged a conservatorship. They mortgaged a house they did not own. Each act was a stitch in a noose they were tying around their own necks, and the only thing I had to do was stop trying to take the rope out of their hands. There is a kind of justice that does not require shouting. It only requires patience and a clear conscience. I want to be honest about something, though. The hardest part was not the waiting. The hardest part was the moment I almost broke and walked back into that dining room with the will in my hand. I wanted so badly to win loud. I wanted them to know I was not stupid, not invisible, not the girl who refilled the bourbon. But I have learned that wanting to be seen is the trap that keeps you small. The people who hurt you the most are the ones who already decided you do not matter. Trying to prove them wrong on their terms is how they keep you on the chessboard they built. So I stopped trying to win their game. I built mine. If you are sitting in a house tonight where you have to be quiet to survive, I want you to hear me. You are not crazy. The thing inside you that keeps whispering, "This is not right, this is not normal, this is not love," that voice is the most reliable thing you own. Protect it. Write things down. Keep copies. Find one person outside the house who knows the truth, even if the only thing you can tell them is the date. You do not have to be brave today. You only have to be honest with yourself for one more morning. My grandmother taught me that strength is not the loudest thing in the room. Strength is the quietest. It is the woman who keeps polishing the silver while she memorizes a phone number. It is the granddaughter who folds the ruined quilt and hides it behind the wine fridge. It is choosing every single day to stay clear-eyed in a house full of fog. The truth is, patient. So am I.